Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to one of those ancient worlds where everything was supposed to make sense to the gods, but very little of it actually made sense to the people. So, dim your lamps, settle into bed, and let's wander softly through the dusty courtyards of Mesopotamia. Now, if you've ever had a bad day at work, just remember this: at least you didn't have to explain to your parents that your new full-time career involved being ritually employed in the service of a temple god. Because yes, welcome to the charming institution of temple prostitution. The term itself is a little misleading. Scholars are still arguing about the exact details, because of course they are. Ancient tablets are vague, sometimes contradictory, and naturally most of the descriptions were written by people who weren't doing the work themselves. But broadly speaking, the idea was that certain temples maintained groups of women, sometimes men too, who engaged in ritualized sex as part of their service to the gods. And no, this wasn't usually as glamorous as the word sacred tries to make it sound. Imagine, for example, that you're a young woman in Babylon. You may not be especially pious, but your family's finances are delicate, let's say. Maybe your father owed money, maybe your uncle lost his goats, or maybe your mother just really wanted to say she had a daughter dedicated to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, because nothing says good family standing quite like loaning your child to a deity. And so, off you go. To a temple courtyard where, depending on which ancient writer you trust, you either had to wait around until some stranger picked you, or you had to fulfill a ritual obligation once in your life by sleeping with someone at the temple and donating the fee to the goddess. Naturally, Herodotus, writing centuries later, gave us the spiciest version. He claimed every Babylonian woman had to do this at least once, waiting in the temple of Ishtar until a man tossed a coin into her lap and said something vaguely religious. At which point, congratulations, you were sacred. Now, modern historians are not entirely convinced Herodotus was accurate. He was enthusiastic, let's say, about exoticizing the people he wrote about. He also claimed the phoenix was real, and that gold-digging ants lived in India. So, interpret accordingly. But even if we strip away the exaggerations, the reality wasn't exactly cozy. Temples were vast institutions. They owned land, slaves, livestock, and, of course, human labor. The men who ran them had a vested interest in making sure their goddess was well funded. What better way than to mix devotion with commerce? If you're drifting off right now, picture this slowly: the temple courtyard, sun-baked mud brick walls glowing in the heat, priests shuffling in linen robes, the faint smell of burning incense mixed with, well, whatever else was going on. And a row of young women sitting quietly, each waiting to be selected. Some anxious, some resigned, some probably wondering whether the goddess truly needed this, or whether the priests just had a good racket going. It wasn't all misery, though. In some cities, temple women had semi-respected positions. They might be trained in music, singing hymns, or dancing. Some even lived communally in temple compounds, not unlike priestesses. But the stigma lingered. When later writers wanted to insult Babylon, they pointed to this practice as proof that the whole civilization was decadent. And decadence, of course, sells. Herodotus' tale became so popular that later Europeans couldn't stop repeating it, convinced that Babylon had basically been one long desert brothel. Which is ironic, because those same Europeans had no problem with their own kings keeping mistresses, concubines, and the occasional choir boy. But when the Babylonians did it, well, that was clearly barbaric. Let's drift a little deeper into this. Imagine being one of these women. You might have been called a Naditu or a Kadistu, depending on the city. Some were technically cloistered priestesses, others attached to the goddess of love herself. The titles varied, but the general theme was that your body was in the service of a divine being. Which sounds lofty, until you remember it often translated to an endless stream of awkward encounters with strangers. And because this is Mesopotamia, everything had to be recorded on clay tablets. So somewhere out there, in a museum drawer, are receipts documenting how much silver someone paid for the privilege of fulfilling his sacred duty. Few things kill the romance of divine intimacy quite like an accountant. The economics of it are quietly fascinating. In a city like Uruk or Babylon, silver was scarce. Grain was common. So fees could be paid in barley, dates, or goats. Imagine the scene: You've just finished your divine duty, and the man hands you a sack of barley, which you then pass to the temple priest, who solemnly notes it down in cuneiform. Nothing says holiness like 37 liters of grain. Now, in fairness, not every temple woman was miserable. Some, especially the higher-ranked Naditu, lived in walled compounds where they handled property, loans, and business deals. They were, essentially, economic agents of the goddess. But let's be clear, they were also not allowed to marry or have children. They could accumulate wealth, but not families. So yes, you might become quite rich, and also spectacularly lonely. And then there was the little matter of disease. Mesopotamia was not known for its advanced hygiene. Bathing was infrequent, rivers were full of parasites, and doctors specialized in chanting incantations at your sores. Combine that with temple sexuality, and you can imagine the health risks. The goddess of love, it turns out, was not very good at handing out ointment. The irony here is thick. Mesopotamian kings boasted endlessly about their devotion to the gods. They built towering ziggurats, carved inscriptions about their victories, and boasted of keeping the temples richly supplied. But on the ground, that meant young women offering themselves up, sometimes willingly, often not. Kings got eternal glory. Ordinary women got barley. Let's pause for a moment and float back to that courtyard. You're sitting on a low stool, eyes down, waiting. The air is heavy with incense. A priest mutters a prayer. You wonder whether Ishtar is pleased, or if she's even paying attention. Perhaps she's busy elsewhere, laughing at the mortals who invented this practice in her name. Because if there's one constant in history, it's that gods rarely write the rule books. Priests do. And so, life goes on. Women cycled in and out of temple service. Some returned to families. Others remained cloistered for life. Some gained influence, advising kings or managing estates. But for many, it was just one more example of how the divine, the political, and the personal were mashed together in ways that left ordinary people, especially women, holding the short end of the barley sack. And if you're already half asleep, that's probably appropriate. Because drifting through Mesopotamian religion is a little like falling into warm mud. You sink, slowly, surrounded by strange rituals and half-understood customs. You hear faint echoes of hymns sung to Ishtar. You picture clay tablets filled with neat wedge marks. And you realize, with a quiet sigh, that it really did suck to be a temple prostitute. But of course, Mesopotamia wasn't the only place where people confused divinity with deeply awkward human arrangements. Other civilizations had their own charming ideas. Which means we can gently float, now, toward the next royal fiasco. Hey everyone! Let's move away from dusty Mesopotamian courtyards and float forward a few thousand years, into the candlelit gloom of European palaces. Tonight's unlucky royal is one of history's favorite examples of what happens when a dynasty forgets the basic rules of genetics. His name was Charles II of Spain. And if you've ever felt like your family tree had a few too many crossed branches, trust me, it's nothing compared to his. Charles was born in 1661. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, the dynasty that had basically made marrying your cousin into a national sport. For over 2 centuries, they carefully arranged marriages to keep their power consolidated. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Sometimes they doubled down by doing both at once, because naturally, one layer of genetic overlap just wasn't enough. By the time Charles arrived, the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled shrub somebody had stomped on. In fact, modern geneticists who ran the numbers concluded that Charles's inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had literally been brother and sister. So yes, not ideal. Now, people in the 17th century didn't know about DNA. But they did notice that Charles wasn't thriving. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because everyone assumed sorcery was involved. In reality, the poor man was just the cumulative result of centuries of Habsburg marriage planning. Let's picture him. Charles had the infamous Habsburg jaw, which wasn't just a mild underbite, it was a jaw so oversized and misshapen that he couldn't properly chew food. His tongue was too big for his mouth. He drooled constantly. He didn't learn to walk until the age of 8. He didn't speak until he was 4. And when he did, most people couldn't understand him. He was, in short, not exactly the dashing royal figure Spain might have wanted. But he was king. Which is a reminder that hereditary monarchy is a system where winning the genetic lottery isn't required. You just need to be born with the right last name, no matter how many times that last name appears on both sides of your family. Charles's reign was not a happy one. Spain at this point was already in decline. The empire was crumbling, the treasury was empty, and its rivals, France, England, the Dutch, were circling like sharks. What Spain needed was a sharp, competent ruler to steer the ship. What they got instead was Charles II, a man who spent most of his life sick, confused, or both. And because this is history, people naturally blamed demons. Court physicians and priests claimed he had been cursed at birth. Exorcisms were performed. They sprinkled him with holy water. They forced him to swallow bits of consecrated wax. Spoiler, none of it worked. He did eventually marry, twice, actually. First to a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was reportedly kind, patient, and utterly miserable. Unsurprisingly, the marriage produced no children. After she died, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess who came with an impressive family tree and a truly alarming number of sisters. The hope was that someone from such a famously fertile family could finally give Spain an heir. She could not. It wasn't entirely Maria Anna's fault. Charles's body was so ravaged by genetic disorders that he was probably sterile. He also suffered from epilepsy, intestinal issues, and chronic infections. One physician described his body as being the shape of a frog. Another noted that his head seemed too large for his body. These were not the kinds of medical reports that inspired confidence. Now, being childless wouldn't have been such a disaster if Spain hadn't been such a prize. But every European power was eyeing the Spanish throne, waiting for Charles to die. Which meant his entire adult life was essentially one long, slow-motion crisis. Imagine being him, constantly sick, constantly whispered about, constantly pressured to produce children he physically could not. He prayed endlessly. He went on pilgrimages. He wept in front of relics. He truly believed he was cursed. And to be fair, from his perspective, it probably felt true. When he finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, his autopsy was grim. His body, they reported, did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotted. His head was full of water. And, most memorably, his testicles were black, withered, and the size of peas. So yes, not the kind of posthumous report card anyone would want. Charles's death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that dragged on for over a decade, killed hundreds of thousands, and reshaped the continent. All because one inbred monarch couldn't leave an heir. So the next time someone tells you royal marriages were all about love and romance, just remember Charles II. A man whose family thought the best way to preserve their empire was to recycle the same limited gene pool until it finally collapsed on itself. And of course, Spain wasn't the only place where this happened. The Habsburgs had branches everywhere, all of them busy marrying their cousins, uncles, and nieces. Which means we can gently float toward yet another royal family who made similarly questionable decisions. So, we've floated past the inbred halls of Vienna, where Habsburg children struggled to survive their own family tree. Now we can drift across the Channel, into the damp palaces of England, where the Tudors were busy proving that you didn't need generations of incest to produce weak heirs. Sometimes all it took was bad luck, bad health, and Henry VIII's personal obsession with sons. Henry VIII, of course, is remembered mostly for his 6 wives and the small detail of creating an entire church just to divorce them. He was large, temperamental, fond of jousting, and absolutely convinced that his manhood would only be validated by a healthy male heir. Which was awkward, because most of his children died. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave birth to 6 children. Only one survived infancy, Mary, later known as Bloody Mary. The rest were stillborn or died within weeks. Henry was not pleased. He blamed Catherine, naturally. Because in the 16th century, if a marriage didn't produce sons, it was always the woman's fault. Never mind that Henry himself probably carried a genetic issue that caused recurrent miscarriages. No, much easier to blame the wife. So Henry divorced Catherine, broke with Rome, and married in Boleyn. And, clever and ambitious, gave him one daughter, Elizabeth. Not a son. Worse, she miscarried several times after that, one of which was reportedly a deformed fetus. Rumors spread quickly: witchcraft, curses, divine punishment. The truth was probably just fragile genetics again. But Henry, in his usual delicate manner, accused Anne of adultery and had her executed. Next came Jane Seymour, who finally produced the long-awaited boy, Edward. Everyone celebrated. Bells rang, bonfires blazed. England rejoiced, finally, a son. Except Edward was frail from the start. Pale, sickly, prone to coughing fits. Jane herself died of infection just days after his birth. The price of a son, it seemed, was his mother. Edward VI did reign, technically, after Henry's death. But he reigned from a sickbed. Tuberculosis gnawed at him. He wasted away over 6 years, until by age 15 he was little more than a skeleton. His doctors bled him, purged him, and stuffed him with strange concoctions. Nothing helped. He died whispering prayers, leaving no heirs of his own. Which left Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, to take the throne. Mary had survived her mother's endless pregnancies, but she did not escape her family's curse of misfortune. She was deeply pious, rigid, and determined to restore Catholicism to England. Her reign was marked by burnings at the stake, religious turmoil, and the small embarrassment of multiple phantom pregnancies. Yes, twice she was convinced she was carrying a child, her belly swelling, symptoms real, only for no baby to arrive. Modern doctors suspect ovarian tumors or severe hormonal imbalances. At the time, it was just seen as God's mysterious will. Mary died childless at 42. Which meant the throne passed to Elizabeth, and Boleyn's daughter. Elizabeth was shrewd, brilliant, and suspicious of marriage. She styled herself the Virgin Queen, claiming to be wed only to her kingdom. In reality, she likely avoided marriage because she'd seen firsthand how dangerous childbirth was for women, and because she refused to share power with any man. Clever choice for survival. Not so clever for the dynasty. She produced no heirs. So, after all Henry's wives, divorces, executions, and desperate attempts to secure the line, the Tudor dynasty ended exactly where it had started, with a single surviving child on the throne, and no sons to carry the name. Picture that for a moment. Henry VIII spent 3 decades tearing his kingdom apart in search of sons. 6 wives. Countless executions. A whole new church. And at the end of it, his dynasty fizzled out in a puff of childlessness. The irony is so neat, it almost feels scripted. And, of course, this meant England had to import a new dynasty, the Stuarts, from Scotland. Which brings us to yet another royal family with a knack for dysfunction. So, we've floated past the inbred halls of Vienna, where Habsburg children struggled to survive their own family tree. Now we can drift across the Channel, into the damp palaces of England, where the Tudors were busy proving that you didn't need generations of incest to produce weak heirs. Sometimes all it took was bad luck, bad health, and Henry VIII's personal obsession with sons. Henry VIII, of course, is remembered mostly for his 6 wives and the small detail of creating an entire church just to divorce them. He was large, temperamental, fond of jousting, and absolutely convinced that his manhood would only be validated by a healthy male heir. Which was awkward, because most of his children died. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave birth to 6 children. Only one survived infancy, Mary, later known as Bloody Mary. The rest were stillborn or died within weeks. Henry was not pleased. He blamed Catherine, naturally. Because in the 16th century, if a marriage didn't produce sons, it was always the woman's fault. Never mind that Henry himself probably carried a genetic issue that caused recurrent miscarriages. No, much easier to blame the wife. So Henry divorced Catherine, broke with Rome, and married in Boleyn. And, clever and ambitious, gave him one daughter, Elizabeth. Not a son. Worse, She miscarried several times after that, one of which was reportedly a deformed fetus. Rumors spread quickly: witchcraft, curses, divine punishment. The truth was probably just fragile genetics again. But Henry, in his usual delicate manner, accused Anne of adultery and had her executed. Next came Jane Seymour, who finally produced the long-awaited boy, Edward. Everyone celebrated. Bells rang, bonfires blazed. England rejoiced: finally, a son. Except Edward was frail from the start. Pale, sickly, prone to coughing fits. Jane herself died of infection just days after his birth. The price of a son, it seemed, was his mother. Edward VI did reign, technically, after Henry's death. But he reigned from a sickbed. Tuberculosis gnawed at him. He wasted away over 6 years, until by age 15 he was little more than a skeleton. His doctors bled him, purged him, and stuffed him with strange concoctions. Nothing helped. He died whispering prayers, leaving no heirs of his own. Which left Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, to take the throne. Mary had survived her mother's endless pregnancies, but she did not escape her family's curse of misfortune. She was deeply pious, rigid, and determined to restore Catholicism to England. Her reign was marked by burnings at the stake, religious turmoil, and the small embarrassment of multiple phantom pregnancies. Yes, twice she was convinced she was carrying a child, her belly swelling, symptoms real, only for no baby to arrive. Modern doctors suspect ovarian tumors or severe hormonal imbalances. At the time, it was just seen as God's mysterious will. Mary died childless at 42. Which meant the throne passed to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. Elizabeth was shrewd, brilliant, and suspicious of marriage. She styled herself the Virgin Queen, claiming to be wed only to her kingdom. In reality, she likely avoided marriage because she'd seen firsthand how dangerous childbirth was for women, and because she refused to share power with any man. Clever choice for survival. Not so clever for the dynasty. She produced no heirs. So, after all Henry's wives, divorces, executions, and desperate attempts to secure the line, the Tudor dynasty ended exactly where it had started, with a single surviving child on the throne, and no sons to carry the name. Picture that for a moment. Henry VIII spent 3 decades tearing his kingdom apart in search of sons. 6 wives. Countless executions. A whole new church. And at the end of it, his dynasty fizzled out in a puff of childlessness. The irony is so neat, it almost feels scripted. And, of course, this meant England had to import a new dynasty, the Stuarts, from Scotland. Which brings us to yet another royal family with a knack for dysfunction. Hey everyone! Let's dim the lanterns and wander slowly through the palaces of ancient China, where meals were not just meals, they were cosmic events. Emperors didn't simply eat. They communed with heaven through the medium of questionable delicacies. Now, Chinese cuisine today is celebrated worldwide: dumplings, noodles, stir-fries. Balanced flavors, harmony of yin and yang. But at the imperial court, things got stranger. Because when you're the son of heaven, ordinary rice and cabbage simply won't do. Let's start with bird's nest soup. Still considered a delicacy today, but in the Tang and Ming courts, it was practically holy. The nests, made by swiftlets from their hardened saliva, had to be harvested from high cave walls. Men dangled from ropes, scraping nests while hoping not to fall to their deaths. Also, the emperor could sip a bowl of gelatinous broth with the texture of, let's be honest, warm wallpaper paste. The taste was mild. The symbolism was rich. Supposedly it strengthened the body and ensured longevity. Naturally, emperors ordered it in absurd quantities. And then there were sea cucumbers. Creatures that resemble, well, fat slugs, slowly inching along the seabed. Hardly the stuff of royal feasts. Yet in the Qing dynasty, they were prized as tonics for virility. Which is probably why the famously vigorous Emperor Qianlong adored them. Served braised, soaked, or stewed in sauces, they had little flavor of their own, but plenty of chewy texture. Exactly what you want when you're trying to prove your cosmic mandate through dinner. Shark fin was another favorite. not because it tasted particularly wonderful, but because it symbolized power. To serve shark fin soup was to say, I control the seas. I command even the fiercest beasts. Which is a nice way of distracting everyone from the fact that you're eating cartilage and broth. But the strangest dishes were often the ones no one outside the court was allowed to taste. The Han emperors dined on bare paws, prized for their tenderness. Supposedly the left paw was more delicious, because it was softer from the animal using its right paw more often. Imagine the imperial kitchen staff carefully noting which paw went where, as if heaven itself would be offended if the wrong limb was served. Then there were the eggs. Not ordinary eggs, of course. Virgin boy eggs were a delicacy in some regions, a dish made by boiling eggs in the urine of prepubescent boys. Don't worry, it was all very medicinal. Said to restore vitality and prevent heat stroke. And while it was mostly a folk practice, court physicians occasionally endorsed similar treatments. Because when you live in an age where swallowing powdered rhinoceros horn counts as medicine, nothing is off the table. Speaking of rhinos, yes, powdered horn was ground into soups and tonics. Also tiger bones, deer antlers, and even dried seahorses. If it lived, breathed, or wriggled, someone in the imperial court believed it could be stewed into health. The palace kitchens were as much apothecaries as dining halls. And then there's the matter of sheer scale. The Qianlong Emperor, in the 18th century, reportedly had banquets with over 100 dishes served at once. Meals could last hours. Each dish had a symbolic meaning. Duck for loyalty, carp for abundance, noodles for long life. By the end, the emperor probably tasted only a spoonful of each. But that wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate that heaven had provided him with the bounty of the entire empire, whether or not he wanted to chew on jellyfish skin. If you're starting to feel drowsy, imagine this softly: lacquered tables groaning under porcelain bowls, steam rising from delicate bamboo baskets, servants shuffling silently across marble floors. Outside, the courtyards are dark, lanterns swaying in the night breeze. Inside, the emperor picks at a dish of sea slug with chopsticks made of jade. The room smells of soy, ginger, sesame oil, and just a faint undertone of boiled bird saliva. It wasn't only about taste. Food was medicine, ritual, symbol. The emperor's diet was carefully managed by court physicians, who believed every ingredient affected his balance of qi. A bowl of millet porridge could be as important as bear paw stew. If the emperor sneezed, someone probably blamed last night's bamboo shoots. And, of course, the meals were also about power. To eat what no one else could eat was to remind the world that you were not merely a man, but the axis between heaven and earth. Ordinary people ate rice and pickles. Emperors ate shark fins and leopard feet as stew. Yes, that was a thing too. No, it didn't catch on as street food. It's all a little surreal, drifting through these menus. Some of the dishes were genuinely refined. Others were eccentric at best. But together, they remind us of the strange truth of monarchy: when you give one man absolute power, he will eventually make someone climb a cliff for a mouthful of hardened bird spit. So, the next time you sit down with a bowl of noodles, be grateful. They're simple, filling, and you didn't have to endanger your life scraping them from a cave. And with that, we can let the imperial kitchens fade softly into the night. Because there are still more dynasties, more oddities, and more royal fiascos waiting just beyond the horizon. Qin Shi Huang in the quest for immortality. Hey everyone! Let's drift further into the mists of ancient China, to the late 3rd century BCE. Tonight's restless sleeper is Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of united China. A man who conquered kingdoms, standardized weights and measures, built vast roads, and started the Great Wall, and then panicked at the thought of dying. Now, to be fair, most people don't want to die. But Qin Shi Huang wanted it less than anyone else. He wanted to live forever. Not metaphorically. Literally. He demanded that his court alchemists find him the recipe for immortality. Because of course he did. You don't unify an empire and then settle for the same mortal fate as the peasants. Unfortunately for him, the state of ancient Chinese medicine was experimental. Alchemists firmly believed that ingesting rare minerals could extend life. Gold, jade, cinnabar, mercury. Yes, mercury. The silvery liquid metal we now know to be extremely poisonous. Back then, however, it shimmered like divine magic. Surely the gods had poured it into the earth as a gift. So the emperor swallowed it. In pill form, in potions, in little cakes of cinnabar and mercury salts. Court doctors assured him these elixirs would strengthen his chi, purify his body, and render him immortal. Instead, they slowly poisoned him from the inside out. His gums blackened. His skin blotched. His mind frayed. Modern doctors suggest mercury toxicity made him paranoid and unstable. Which, considering he was already prone to paranoia, didn't help. Picture it, the emperor in his grand hall at Xianyang, pacing the polished stone floors, convinced assassins lurked in every shadow. He rarely slept in the same bed twice, moving from palace to palace, hoping to confuse his enemies. His servants carried crossbows at the ready. Visitors were searched thoroughly. And still, he was convinced death was stalking him. He also developed a delightful habit of sending out expeditions to find magical islands of immortals. Entire fleets sailed eastward, commanded by alchemists who promised to return with elixirs from the gods. Some ships never came back. Others returned sheepishly with excuses. One famously claimed that sea monsters had blocked the way. Qin Shi Huang, not amused, had them executed. As you do. But his greatest monument to his obsession with death, or rather, with refusing it, was his tomb. A vast underground palace, constructed by hundreds of thousands of laborers. Inside, he ordered the creation of rivers of mercury to flow through artificial landscapes, meant to mimic his empire in miniature. He also had armies of terracotta soldiers molded to guard him eternally. Thousands of life-sized clay warriors, each with unique faces. Silent company for the afterlife he pretended he wouldn't enter. Ironically, those rivers of mercury may still be there. Archaeologists believe the tomb chamber remains sealed because of dangerous mercury contamination. Which means Qin Shi Huang may have succeeded in one way: his obsession with mercury still keeps people away, 2,000 years later. In the end, of course, he died anyway. Around the age of 49, in 210 BCE, on a tour of his empire. His body was quietly transported back to the capital in a cart of fish, to disguise the smell of decay. The first emperor of China, who had demanded eternal life, was trundled home under a blanket of rotting carp. It's darkly funny, in that quiet historical way. He built walls across mountains, armies of clay soldiers, fleets to search for immortality. And still, in the end, he was just another man in a cart, reeking of fish. If you're drifting towards sleep now, picture it gently, moonlight over the silent ranks of terracotta warriors, their clay eyes staring forward for eternity. Beneath them, a tomb sealed with poison rivers. And somewhere within, the restless spirit of a man who could not accept that his story, like everyone's, must eventually come to an end. But of course, Qin Shi Huang was hardly alone in this obsession. Other rulers, in other lands, tried their own bizarre methods to cheat death. Some sought magical potions. Others turned to alchemists, astrologers, or, failing all else, a steady diet of hope. Which means we can drift onward, to the next royal figure who found mortality inconvenient, and made things worse in the process. So, we've left Qin Shi Huang, embalmed in mercury fumes, resting uneasily under his clay battalions. But here's the thing, his successors, the emperors of the Han Dynasty, looked at that whole fiasco and thought, yes, let's do exactly that. Because naturally, they did. The Han Dynasty began in 206 BCE, and its rulers wanted very badly to avoid the fate of their first emperor predecessor. The trouble was, medicine hadn't advanced much beyond let's swallow shiny things and hope. And so, like obedient children copying their elders' homework, they turned back to the alchemists. Take Emperor Wu of Han. Now, Wu was one of those emperors who loved doing everything at once. He expanded the empire, strengthened the bureaucracy, opened the Silk Road, and, of course, demanded eternal life. He summoned magicians and sorcerers to court, desperate to hear about mystical islands where immortal beings drank nectar and lived forever. The familiar stories of Penglai, the fabled island of the immortals, made a comeback. Expeditions were sent out with state funding. Some never returned, which, given the budget, was probably just as well. But Wu also began down the same mercurial path as Qin Shi Huang. Alchemists prepared him elixirs laced with metals and minerals. Cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was especially popular. It glowed red like a divine powder and was thought to replenish life energy. He ingested it regularly, and his health began to collapse. Toward the end of his reign, he was reportedly paranoid, irritable, and plagued by hallucinations. Which, again, is what happens when you poison yourself with mercury for breakfast. He died in 87 BCE, not immortal but rather, predictably mortal. His successors should have learned. But instead, the idea of elixirs stuck around like a stubborn superstition. Fast forward to the Eastern Han period. Emperor Ai of Han, who ruled from 7 to 1 BCE, also dabbled in magical pills. His reign was short, partly because he spent too much energy trusting quacks who promised eternal life. He was barely in his 20s when he died, tragically young, though one suspects the cinnabar diet didn't help. Then there was Emperor Xian, the last Han ruler, more of a tragic puppet than an actual emperor. His court, filled with schemers and warlords, still prescribed immortality pills to him, as though that would preserve the dynasty. Instead, the dynasty fell apart, he abdicated, and the Great Han collapsed. Pills can't fix politics, it turns out. It's remarkable how consistent the pattern is. Ruler swallows mercury, ruler dies younger than expected, everyone shrugs and tries it again. Generation after generation. You can almost imagine the alchemists rubbing their hands together, thinking, ah yes, another customer who won't live to demand a refund. Of course, it wasn't just Chinese emperors doing this. Across the world, kings, queens, and nobles had the same fear of mortality. If you're nodding off, let yourself drift on the thought. People who could command armies and build empires still fell for the same snake oil pitches that today might involve an overpriced vitamin subscription. Let's float gently westward, then, to another court filled with royal hypochondriacs. A place where frail kings drank bizarre concoctions, not for immortality, but for protection against the very thing they feared most, poison. Because if you couldn't live forever, you could at least try not to be murdered at dinner. We've already brushed against it when talking about Qin Shi Huang's tomb. But it's worth slowing down, letting our thoughts wander carefully through the chambers of earth, to the strange and patient army buried there. When Qin Shi Huang envisioned his afterlife, he didn't want to enter it as a solitary traveler. No, that would have been too ordinary. He wanted to go as an emperor. Which meant guards, attendants, musicians, chariots, and, of course, an entire military force at his command. Death, to him, was simply another campaign. And he prepared for it with the same obsession that had marked his reign. Around 246 BCE, when he was still only the king of Qin and not yet the first emperor, construction of his mausoleum began. Hundreds of thousands of workers were conscripted to carve into the hills near modern Xi'an. Deep chambers were dug. Vast halls were lined with earth. Into these spaces, craftsmen set about molding soldiers, not of flesh, but of clay. Each terracotta warrior stood roughly life-sized. And, curiously, no two are exactly alike. Some have round faces, others sharp. Some are mustaches, others are clean-shaven. Their hairstyles vary, their expressions are distinct. It's as if the artisans were told, make them look alive, but not too alive. And so they did. Rows upon rows of frozen individuality, soldiers who would never disobey, never tire, never fall in battle. The figures weren't just soldiers, either. Archaeologists have uncovered generals with ornate armor, charioteers in rigid poses, and even horses sculpted with remarkable detail. Whole battalions were arranged in formation, facing east, ready to march into eternity. Now, as soothing as the rows look today, quiet, still, slightly eerie, the army was once dazzling. Each figure had been brightly painted, with red tunics, green trousers, black hair, and vivid facial details. When first unearthed, traces of this color still clung to the clay. But almost immediately upon contact with air, the paint flaked away, vanishing in minutes. Which means what we see today, muted clay-gray soldiers, is only half the story. The real vision was far more theatrical, a rainbow army prepared to serve forever. And they weren't alone. Excavations revealed dancers, musicians, and acrobats buried nearby, suggesting that the emperor also wanted nightly entertainment in the afterlife. Imagine the scene: terracotta troops standing at attention, while clay musicians play clay flutes, and acrobats tumble stiffly in the shadows. A frozen empire beneath the earth, waiting endlessly. And above them, the tomb chamber itself, still sealed. Historical texts describe rivers of mercury flowing through an underground map of the empire, glinting like stars in torchlight. Mountains made of bronze. A ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the constellations. A private cosmos for an emperor who demanded more than a coffin and a stone marker. He wanted to take the entire world with him. The most haunting part, perhaps, is how much remains untouched. Only fragments of the mausoleum complex have been explored. The main chamber is still closed, partly to preserve it, and partly because, according to soil tests, the mercury levels there are alarmingly high. The emperor's obsession with that toxic metal has, even now, made his resting place dangerous to disturb. It's a strange kind of immortality. Not the one he wanted, but something close. His name, his soldiers, his tomb, all still commanding attention, 2,000 years later. And yet, for all his armies and monuments, his body rests as fragile dust, no different from the peasants who once built his dream. So, if your eyes are growing heavy, picture the soft silence of that underground hall. The clay feet rooted in packed earth. The quiet rows, standing watch an endless night. No sound but the slow shifting of soil. And somewhere, deep at the center, a sealed chamber glowing faintly with mercury's shimmer, the restless palace of an emperor who could not let go. But of course, China was not the only place where rulers demanded armies and death. Across the world, ancient kings and queens often surrounded themselves with attendants, sacrifices, and monuments for the afterlife. Sometimes in clay. Sometimes in flesh. Sometimes in gold. And as we drift onward, we can move gently from those silent terracotta faces, across time and desert sands, to another royal obsession with eternity, the pharaohs of Egypt, who wrapped themselves in linen, stacked pyramids toward the sky, and also discovered that immortality is easier said than done. So, let's settle in at the banks of the Nile, where the river glows silver under moonlight and the pyramids rise like jagged shadows against the horizon. Egypt, land of gods and afterlives, where rulers treated death less as an ending and more as an administrative transfer. Pharaohs were not content to slip quietly into the next world. No. They wanted to arrive in style, ideally with enough gold, linen, servants, and food to keep them comfortable forever. After all, what was eternity without proper amenities? The Egyptians were confident, or perhaps, let's say, stubbornly optimistic, that the body had to be preserved in order for the soul to survive. Which is why they became very good at turning people into something between a raisin and a piece of driftwood. We call it mummification. They called it preparation. And they practiced it for well over 2,000 years. The process was long, messy, and a bit grotesque. The body was stripped, washed, and salted. Organs were removed and placed in jars shaped like small, slightly judgmental gods. The brain was often pulled out through the nose with a hook, a detail that, once you know it, never quite leaves you. The body was dried with natron, a mineral salt, and then wrapped in endless layers of linen, sometimes soaked in resin to seal it. The end result was a figure bound tightly like an overzealous Christmas present, ready for the next life. And this wasn't just about preservation. Each step had ritual meaning. Each jar, amulet, and wrapping was meant to protect the pharaoh from dangers on the long journey to the afterlife. Because of course, death wasn't enough. One had to fight monsters, recite spells, and pass judgment before Osiris, the god of the dead. The Egyptians didn't make eternity sound relaxing so much as bureaucratic. The pyramids, of course, were the most dramatic statement. Vast, gleaming tombs built with backbreaking labor, their stones dragged across the desert to house a single man and his belongings. Inside, narrow passages wound downward to burial chambers stocked with treasures, chariots, jewelry, food, wine, even board games. Imagine preparing for forever and thinking, yes, I'll need my Senate set in case the afterlife gets boring. But the pyramids had one major problem: visibility. A giant triangular mountain of stone in the middle of the desert is, unsurprisingly, very hard to hide. Which meant tomb robbing became something of a national pastime. Despite all the curses and guards and elaborate traps, most pyramids were looted within centuries. The pharaohs who had imagined themselves reclining for eternity surrounded by treasures instead spent it stripped bare, their wrappings torn, their gold melted down into someone else's jewelry. Later pharaohs tried to be sneakier, hiding their tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Caverns cut into desert cliffs, far less obvious than pyramids. Still, many of those too were robbed. If eternity depends on your valuables not being stolen, eternity becomes rather difficult to secure. And yet, the Egyptians clung to the belief. Century after century, dynasty after dynasty, they salted and wrapped and entombed their rulers. And in a way, it worked. We still know their names. Ramses, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra. Not immortal in body, but in memory. King Tut is a particularly curious case. He was a minor pharaoh, ruling only about a decade, but his tomb survived relatively intact. When it was uncovered in 1922, the world gasped at the gold mask, the jewels, the furniture, the chariots. Yet the boy king himself was frail, likely disabled, with a club foot and health issues caused by inbreeding. So, the most dazzling tomb of all belonged not to Egypt's greatest pharaoh, but to one of its weakest. History has a way of being ironic like that. So if your thoughts are slowing now, picture the silence inside one of those tombs. Dust motes floating in the beam of a flickering lamp. The painted walls, bright with gods and symbols. A coffin wrapped in linen, resting quietly, waiting for eternity that never quite arrived. But Egypt was only one chapter in humanity's long obsession with cheating death. The desire to outwit mortality turned up everywhere, in Mesopotamian temples, in Chinese palaces, in European courts. Each time, rulers built monuments, swallowed concoctions, or wrapped themselves in linen. And each time, eternity slipped away anyway. Let's drift gently from the pyramids now, across seas and centuries, to the courts of medieval Europe, where kings and queens, lacking pyramids, still managed to find wonderfully absurd ways to keep death at bay. Spoiler, it didn't work. Let's imagine the Adriatic in the 3rd century BCE. Narrow inlets, rocky islands, and sudden storms. It wasn't exactly the kind of sea where you'd want to take a luxury cruise. But for the Illyrians, a loose collection of tribes who lived along the coast of what is now Albania, Montenegro, and Croatia, it was home. And more importantly, it was opportunity. The Illyrians had boats. Not elegant triremes like the Greeks, or lumbering cargo ships like the Romans. Their vessels were called lembi, light, swift galleys, easy to maneuver. Perfect for darting out from hidden coves, attacking a merchant ship, and vanishing again before anyone could respond. In modern terms, you could think of them less as a navy and more as a very aggressive fishing club. Now, piracy in the ancient world was, let's say, flexible. The Greeks sometimes did it, the Phoenicians occasionally indulged, and even the Romans weren't above a little sea robbery when it suited them. But the Illyrians took it further. Piracy wasn't just a sideline. It was practically the national economy. Why farm rocky hillsides when you could raid a fat Greek trading vessel and come home with amphorae of wine and bolts of silk? The Greeks were, predictably, outraged. Which is to say, they complained loudly but also bought stolen goods when it was convenient. Athens, Rhodes, and Corinth all filed their grievances, but the Illyrians kept sailing. Their coastlines were so jagged and their ships so nimble that chasing them down was like trying to herd cats with oars and swords. By the 3rd century BCE, the Illyrians had even formalized things. Queen Tuta, who ruled a section of the coast, famously declared that piracy was not a crime at all, but a noble profession. She told Roman envoys that her people had every right to raid whoever they pleased. Naturally, this went down poorly in Rome, where senators were used to the idea that they alone set the rules of civilization. So, the Romans did what Romans always did. They sent legions. Or, in this case, legions with boats. In 229 BCE, the First Illyrian War began, less a war, more a Roman crackdown on what they considered unruly fishermen with delusions of grandeur. Still, the Illyrians resisted fiercely. Their ships darted between islands, ambushing stragglers, refusing to line up neatly for destruction. Eventually, though, Rome was Rome. Numbers, discipline, and an alarming willingness to keep coming wore the Illyrians down. Queen Tuta was forced to surrender. She agreed to limit her people's piracy to only certain parts of the Adriatic, a deal which sounds suspiciously like Rome saying, "Fine, steal things, but only if it doesn't bother us." Did the Illyrians stop? Of course not. They simply found new coves, new victims, new excuses. Rome fought more Illyrian wars, each one a little more decisive, until the tribes were finally subdued. By the 1st century BCE, the Adriatic was firmly under Roman control, and Illyrian piracy became less of a menace and more of a memory. But the story stuck. The Illyrians became, in the classical imagination, shorthand for sea banditry. The wild folk of the Adriatic. And in a way, they prefigured the pirates of every later age, the Vikings, the Barbary corsairs, even the Caribbean freebooters. Wherever there's a coastline and trade, there will always be someone thinking, or, "I could just take it." So, if you're drifting now, picture the Adriatic under moonlight. A quiet cove. A small galley rocking gently against the shore. Men with rough cloaks and sharper knives, waiting for the signal to row out. The sea has always belonged as much to thieves as to merchants. And the Illyrians were simply honest enough to admit it. And as the sea breeze fades, we can drift onward to the next set of rulers and rogues. Because the Mediterranean was never quiet for long. From Illyrian pirates, it's only a gentle turn of the tide to another group who made waves, the Ptolemies of Egypt. Royals who weren't content to just lose sleep over immortality, but also made family dinners into full-blown political crises. So, we're back in Alexandria. Marble columns, libraries, temples, and a royal family so spectacularly dysfunctional that even the gods might have sighed in resignation. The Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. And they managed, in that time, to embody almost every tragicomic feature of monarchy: paranoia, inbreeding, murder, and family drama that would make a modern soap opera seem restrained. The dynasty began with Ptolemy I, who seized Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. He was competent, pragmatic, and ambitious. Unfortunately, his descendants inherited fewer of those qualities and more of a shared belief that the family tree should look more like a family wreath. Brother married sister. Uncle married niece. Cousins married cousins. If it sounds confusing, that's because it was. Even ancient historians had trouble keeping track of who was married to whom, and who had stabbed whom in the back that particular year. By the time we reached Ptolemy IV, things were looking particularly strange. He married his sister Arsinoe III, which was considered perfectly normal in Ptolemaic circles. Their reign was marked by indulgence, excessive drinking, and a lack of interest in governance. When he died, possibly poisoned, his infant son became king. The regents immediately had Arsinoe murdered to secure their control. A mother killed while her son was technically pharaoh, before he was old enough to even pronounce pharaoh. This set the tone. Later Ptolemies often alternated between marrying close relatives and murdering them. Sometimes both. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, meaning potbelly, which tells you everything about his reputation, had his nephew killed, married his niece, then also married his niece's mother, and then executed or exiled anyone who looked at him the wrong way. Naturally, Alexandria erupted into riots more than once. Through it all, the dynasty leaned hard into its own mythology. They presented themselves as living gods, heirs to both Egyptian pharaohs and Macedonian conquerors. They sponsored temples and rituals, adorning statues with their likeness. But behind the masks of divinity, family members were poisoning each other at banquets and conspiring in the palace corridors. And of course, the most famous Ptolemy of all was Cleopatra VII. She was intelligent, multilingual, and politically astute. But she also inherited the dynasty's messy family dynamics. Her siblings tried to kill her, she had to arrange for their deaths instead, and her eventual rule was less about romance with Rome and more about surviving the Ptolemaic family reunion. If you're drifting towards sleep now, picture the Ptolemaic court at Alexandria. White marble glinting in the sun. Perfumed air. processions of priests declaring the royal family divine. And just behind a set of curtains, the muffled sound of yet another sibling argument escalating toward assassination. The Ptolemies lasted until 30 BCE, when Cleopatra and Mark Antony's defeat handed Egypt to Rome. It was the end of a dynasty that had spent centuries proving that marrying your sister does not, in fact, make family politics simpler. And so, from the Adriatic pirates to the Egyptian Ptolemies, we see two sides of ancient survival. One relied on speed, cunning, and oars. The other relied on titles, incest, and daggers. Neither, in the long run, achieved immortality. But both left behind stories that remind us how strange human history can be. Let's drift next toward another royal household where family dysfunction reigned supreme. Perhaps the Habsburgs of Europe, with their famously distorted bloodlines and jawlines. Or, if you'd prefer, we can linger in the ancient world a bit longer, maybe into the Seleucids or the Carthaginian elite.